Music. Yep, it was very nice. We are beginning a new series until we come to, until we come to the Lenten season. And I was kind of inspired to select this series on a book that a friend sent to me by Max Lucado, You Were Made for This Moment. I don't know how many of you like Max Lucado. I really like him a lot. He's a great writer, and I think he provides phenomenal insight to, his ability to tell stories, to come up with illustrations and things like that really is very, very good. So anyway, so part of my material I took a little bit from this, and then I probably spent more time on this study than I have for quite a while, at least in terms of what I'm going to do today. So it seems to me that one of the prevailing questions that all of us, whether we do it knowingly or whether we do it subconsciously, is appreciating and understanding what our purpose is, what our context is. Like why is my life meaningful, or why should it be meaningful? And what's its relevance to the world in which I live now? I think those are basic questions and prevailing questions in most of us, and some of us dutifully struggle with that, and some of us do not. Some of us just settle for things like hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, while others of us really want something more. This is a series I think that's going to address those kinds of things. So, while we do this then, the intent is to discover God's purpose in our response during difficult and extraordinary circumstances. And so we're going to begin with the Book of Esther, but from here then I'm going to go into 1 Peter and spend some time in 1 Peter, because Peter lived during a time of extraordinary circumstances and called people to live unique lives in those extraordinary circumstances. So a few things about the Book of Esther before we get into it. I'm not going to go through the whole book because it would take me a month of Sundays to do that. I'm just going to give kind of an overview and hopefully extract from that really important principles and some helpful insights. The Book of Esther is a compelling narrative of how a Jewish girl became queen of Persia and courageously saved her people from genocidal annihilation. Now, think about that. Oh, and by the way, somebody stole that clock back there, so I can't see where I am. I could just assume that means that you just want me to speak for as long as I want. Okay, but rather than suffer the humiliation of a shepherd's crook coming out from the side and yanking me off the stage, if somebody would tell me about 5 minutes until you wave your, I don't want to see a sea of hands, but if somebody would do that, that would be great, That would be great. Okay. So, yeah. Do I want to watch? Yeah, you can, yeah, that'd be fine. Thank you. Thank you. Multiple alarms, all that kind of stuff. So, all right, good. So here are a couple things. No, here's what I want to say. How many of you, when you think of reading the Book of Esther, that you think that here's this woman whose job it became to stop the entire annihilation of every Jewish person in the Persian Empire? And I'm going to go over the Persian Empire, and you'll appreciate the enormity of this task. I mean, because I think that when we read the Book of Esther, we read it kind of, it's like a kind of a quaint story in some ways, But it was anything but that. It is charged with drama and significance. It asks one of the key questions that I think every person should ask or wrestle with throughout the whole of their life. This contained in the Book of Esther. Esther was a book that was anonymously written. We don't know who wrote it. It's dated around 486 to 464 BC, so about somewhere around 500 years before the birth of Christ. It is one of two books that never mentions God. Do you know what the other book is? There are two books in the Bible that never mention God. Esther is one. Do you know what the other book is? Song of Songs, written by Solomon. Song of Songs, written by Solomon. So, kind of interesting. It's the first book which mentions the Jewish secular holiday called the Feast of Purim. So it's the first book that ever mentions a secular holiday of the Feast of Purim. It was not a religious holiday, and still was not a religious holiday. It is a secular holiday that's observed by Jewish people even today. It is the final book that was included in the Jewish canon or Bible. It was the last book that was included. So it doesn't mean it's any less important in some respects, but it was just the last book that was included in the Jewish canon. Now here's my, look, so I want you to know that the fact that the book of Esther never directly mentions God is something that has caused some consternation among Jewish theologians as well as Christian theologians. Like Luther, for example, didn't like the book of Esther, thought it should not have been included because it had no, in his mind, it never talked about the gospel or had redemptive value in that way. So he couldn't, for the life of him, he couldn't figure out why Esther was included in the Jewish canon. But here's my theory. Think about this. Esther is a book that illustrates how God works providentially outside of an immediate religious and or spiritual context. This is how God's working in the lives of people through a secular lens or worldview versus a Judeo or Christian lens or worldview. In other words, any other book that you would read in the Old or New Testament, it is a religious person, it's a religious Jew, it's an observant Jew, or in the New Testament, it's an observant Christian writing from the inside out. This is how God is working. The book of Esther describes how it might look from the outside in. And does this make sense to you? So the beauty of it is, here's evidence of God working providentially that the world doesn't recognize as God working, but He is, and here are some signs and some evidence of that. So, did you ever have that conversation with somebody who would say, I just, they're not a believer. And they'd say, I just don't understand how God is working here. I can't see it. But you can see it. You can see it very clearly how God is working in their life, right? You can even see how God might be using pain and suffering in their life to bring them to a saving faith. You can see it. It's as obvious as anything. They can't see it at all. It's like that. That's the beauty of the book of Esther, I think. It is a book that demonstrates God's providence in a world that has no direct or intimate knowledge of Him. So we have when we think of like Mordecai and Esther and the other Jews in the book of Esther, we don't get any sense in which they are observant Jews. And yet it seems to be clear that God is still working in the lives of those Jews who are in captivity in the Persian Empire. And I'll explain that and unpack that in a little bit. So, again, I just think that's one of that in my mind. Now, I haven't read this any other place, but as I was trying to wrestle with that question, it just seemed to me that this could be one of the explanations about why Esther was included in that way. So, here are some examples of providence, God's guiding hand in the world that you don't see God, but it seems as if something's guiding the process. So the first one would be the removal of Queen Vashti. because nothing happens unless Queen Vashti's out of the way. Then we have this nationwide beauty contest encouraged by the king. Well, he was counseled to do it, but apparently some young men said, hey, now that Vashti's out of the way, why don't you just have this nationwide beauty contest so that you can replace Vashti with some gorgeous-looking woman, or two, or three, or dozen, or several dozen. I don't know if you know that, but they had an all-pro team of concubines, and they had, they had team number 2 of concubines, and so this is what that beauty contest produced for King Azurus, or I like to call him Xerxes, and I'll tell you why I call him Xerxes in a little bit. So then, what happens is, after that, providentially, is that Mordecai, her uncle, overhears this plot to kill the king. And he tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and the people who are plotting against him are found out and killed and gotten out of the way. That comes back big time later on in the story. Then Esther becomes queen of Persia. I mean, it's just astounding how this happens. And then other examples of King Xerxes having insomnia and what comes from that, which is astounding. And then King Xerxes' untimely entry when he sees Haman appearing to be pushing Esther down on a couch while he's getting ready to confront Haman. And so it seals his fate. But all of this is like, nothing happens unless all this happens, but no human agency is making this work. It just seems to happen in a very timely way. So let's look then. So here's the other thing. When I ask you, when did Esther exist? When did she live? In what time, in what context historically? For many of us, we would be very confused because it seems as if this all runs together and we don't know who was with whom and where they lived and what country, and it all seems to run together. So, being a former Bible professor, I'm just going to show it to you, so you get a sense of it. I hope that's okay. But because it's important to understand this. So, about 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, or 4,000 years ago, Abraham and the patriarchs emerged. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, about 4,000 years ago. From 16 to 65 to 1530, the Jews lived in Egypt. And eventually the Hysox took power and they placed the Jews in bondage. About 200 years later, the Jews leave and enter into the Promised Land under Moses. After they enter into the Promised Land and conquer Moses, there's a period of time what we call the period of the judges. They don't have a king. And so these charismatic leaders would rise up and they would help guide Israel. Now, because the judges are a hit and miss kind of thing, the people begin to cry out that they want a king. And so, around 1050, King Saul becomes king of Israel, all 12 tribes. And then David, and then Solomon. At 930 BC, we have the divided kingdom between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And so the kingdom of Israel splits. And 10 tribes to the north form their own kingdom, and 2 tribes to the south, Judah and Benjamin, form their own. So you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom around 930 BC. About 200 years later, the Assyrians and their empire besiege Samaria, and the northern kingdom falls. And the people who live in the northern kingdom are carried off into captivity. Those who haven't been killed are carried off into captivity, or dispersed to other portions of the Assyrian Empire. About 150 years later, at 586 BC, we have the fall of Jerusalem under Babylon. Babylon overpowers Assyria, and now they become the most powerful empire in the world. And then Babylon invades the southern kingdom about 150 years later, and they besiege Jerusalem, and it's pretty horrific what happens there. If you want to read about that, read in the Book of Lamentations, because it's about as graphic and horrible as you can read, and you know, it's just terrible. That what happens under that, I believe it's a 3-year siege in Jerusalem. So then when Jerusalem finally falls, the Babylonians, that's when the ark disappears, that's when the temple is destroyed, and that's when all the remnant of about, so 1/3 are killed, 1/3 die in that siege, and 1/3 are carried off by the Babylonians, and some of them are dispersed throughout the empire. And then that's when also the Babylonians take other people from other parts of their empire, and they put them in Jerusalem, and that's the beginning of the Samaritans. That's why the Jews hate the Samaritans, because they're from all over parts of the Babylonian Empire. The Assyrians did the same thing.
Is that when the temple was taken over?
The temple was destroyed, and that's when the ark of the temple disappeared. So we don't know what happened after the Babylonian capture of Jerusalem. We don't know what happened to the ark. After that, we have the rise of the Persian Empire about 50-some years later. And the Persians were much kinder to the Jews. And it was shortly after that that Cyrus began to let some of the Jews go back into the kingdom, right? And then around 480 BC, or 50 years later, King Xerxes is ruling, and that's when Esther becomes queen, and that's when Mordecai and Esther save the Jewish captives under the Persian Empire. So you see all the stuff that's transpired since then, right? And then after that, more of the exiles begin to return to the Israelite homeland. And after they return, it's not too long after that that the Greeks destroy the Persians. And the Greeks become the largest, most powerful empire right after the Persians. And then after that, the Romans begin to rule over the Persians. And they become the big bully on the block. And then they are reigning for about 70 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. So Esther existed she came into prominence about 500 years before the birth of Christ. And that's important. And you'll see why in a few minutes. So this is how big the Persian Empire was. So to put that in context, they controlled more than 2.9 million square miles. They ruled 44% of the world's population. This is important to understand. How big, how vast, how powerful, how seemingly it would be to run counter to anything that takes place in this empire. It would seem to be an impossibility. It's so big, it's so powerful. The landmass of the Persian Empire was the same landmass as 2 continental USAs. If you took the map of the USA and another map of the USA and you put them together, that's about the same landmass as the Persian Empire. We're already one of the biggest countries in the world in landmass. The Persian Empire was twice our size. So at the time, it was the largest and most powerful empire in the history of the world. So now we come to King Azurus, or I refer to him as Xerxes, and I'll tell you why. Now, King Xerxes was kind of like a ne'er-do-well in many respects. His father was, I want to say he was Darius the First. I believe he was Darius the First, Darius the Great. Yeah, he was, Darius the Great. So think of, when you think of a ne'er-do-well, and I don't want to sound political when I say this, but think of Hunter Biden, okay? He would sort of be like a Hunter Biden, okay? in many respects. He was a drunkard, he was a womanizer, and he was fairly characterless. He ruled over Persia from 486 to 465 BC. His rule marks the beginning of the decline, the slow decline of the Persian Empire. His father was the father who lost the battle against the Greeks, the Battle of Marathon. Do you remember the Battle of Marathon? I've talked about it before many times. But the Battle of Marathon was the first big battle that the Persians lost under Darius I. And that loss was an important loss, and I'll explain to you why. This King Xerxes, though, was also the same king that fought King Leonidas in the Battle of remember the Battle of Thermopylae? The Hot Gates? It was this Xerxes who fought King Leonidas and lost. I mean, didn't lose, but that battle delayed him enough so that the Greeks could recover in time. And it was right after that he also lost the great sea battle of Salamis in 480 BC. It was the greatest sea battle in the history of mankind, and the Persians lost to the Greeks. And it was because of those two losses that the Greeks began to decline, at least on the western portion of their empire. Despite all this, Xerxes was incredibly wealthy. 100 years later, when Alexander the Great invaded Persia and conquered Persia, he went to Susa, the capital. And in Susa, the capital, he discovered 270 tons of gold, minted gold, that in today's numbers are worth $54 billion. Now, $54 billion is a lot of money, right? Now, that's just the gold. That's not the silver. That's not the precious stones. That's not any of the other commodities. Persia was that wealthy. It was that. And let me just say, you don't get that wealthy unless you have the power commensurate to get it. Now, because of his great wealth, he decided to offer a 180-day, a 6-month festival throughout the 127 provinces of Persia. And his goal was to get his generals and his governors and his nobles to go back to battle against the Greeks. So he was sucking up to them. And so he used his vast wealth to produce a festival throughout the empire for 6 months that culminated in a 7th-day feast for all who lived in Susa, rich and poor, but especially for the people who were most influential. So while he was kind of a ne'er-do-well, he was surrounded by people who were still pretty capable. And he was trying to manipulate them into going back to war against the Greeks. And we know this because we have what he's written about it. So I'll read it to you. Originally, Xerxes was not bent on war with Greece. He crushed a revolt in Egypt and called together a council of war to determine whether he should undertake an expedition against Athens. Quote, "As you saw, Darius himself was making preparations for war against these men, but death prevented him from carrying out his purpose." So his father was going to go to war against them, but he died prematurely, and so he couldn't. Then he goes on to say, this is what Xerxes says, "I therefore, on his behalf, and for the benefit of all my subjects, will not rest until I have taken Athens and burn it to the ground in revenge for the injury which the Athenians, without provocation, once did to me and to my father. If we crush the Athenians and their neighbors in the Peloponnese, we shall so extend the empire of Persia that its boundaries will be God's own sky." This is the arrogance of the man. This is how he saw the world. He was that convinced, that compelling in that kind of a way. Now we come to Esther in this story. Esther, who was a woman, a slave, a concubine, queen, and a courageous hero. So here are some of the things you have to understand and appreciate about Esther. Esther is a descendant from those Jews who lived in Jerusalem, carried off into captivity by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. So some 100 years later, after those Babylonian captives were carried off and after the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, she is what's left of those captives that lived in Susa, the capital. She's descendant from them. So as I was doing my research, I ran into this footnote in my Bible. I lifted it off my Bible and took a picture of it and thought, well, it says it better than I can say it, so I'm just going to put it up here for you. It says, the name Mordecai, which is her uncle, so they're related, the name Mordecai occurs in the Persian treasury records of the period as the name of the government official, but whether he was this Mordecai, it is not known, but he could be. This could be the same Mordecai that we can read in Persian records. The Mordecai of the Book of Esther has a genealogy that links him to King Saul and lived 500 years earlier. He belongs to the same tribe, a Benjamite, and his great-grandfather, Kish, was the same name as Saul's father. So this guy, Mordecai, and Esther could have royal blood going all the way back to King Saul, which means they would be of the lineage of David. Does this make sense to you? Okay. So here are some things that were not working for Esther as she's trying to prevent the annihilation of Jews. Number one, she was part of a historically problematic and conquered people. So people did not like the Jews because they were always, at least when they were in Israel, they were always rebelling. They were always problematic. And so she was Jewish, and they had these weird religious rites and laws and observances that nobody else, because they were monotheistic, nobody got that. They called them atheists because they were monotheistic. She was orphaned at an early age. So most orphans don't turn out well, especially in that place and in that time, in that region of the world. She belonged to a slave caste. She was a woman. So women had no power in that day. Zip. And they especially had no power if they were a slave. They especially had no power if they had no family. She was powerless. She was about as powerless as you could be as a woman is concerned. And then there was this double jeopardy that she was regarded as property and a slave as well as being a woman. Then she was made into a concubine for King Xerxes. Team A, but still a concubine. And so she was utterly powerless in a world of incredible power, politics, and social competition. So think of the most powerless person that you can think of today, and then you ask that person, hey, look, there are like going to be hundreds of thousands of people maybe are going to be annihilated, and it's your job to stop them. And then, of course, she had this fear of being exposed as a Jew and death that would come from that. But these were the things that were working for Esther. She was guided by a loving and wise uncle Mordecai. He adopted her as his daughter. He didn't leave her to be an orphan only, but he raised her in a loving and compassionate way, cared for her very much. Because of that, she became a woman of character and wisdom. She was also a woman of exceptional beauty. So apparently, out of the 127 provinces in this beauty contest, she was regarded as the most beautiful woman of all the women that they discovered Of the 54 million people in that empire, she rose to the top. She had the double advantage of having both inner and outer beauty. Her humility, her wisdom, her character drew her to people. When she ended up in Susa, in the citadel, there were a number of eunuchs whose job it was to prepare these concubines, so that they spent a year working on these concubines to make them as beautiful as they possibly could before they were passed on to the king. And you can imagine, can you not, the competition. I mean, my wife tells me that women are incredibly competitive with each other in this way. I don't know that to be true, but that's what she says. That, well, what's that? When they're young, you know, and so she had this incredible competition because they all knew what was at stake. Who got to be with the king? Who maybe could be to earn the king's favor? But Esther distinguished herself among all those other women, and so she gained favor with the people who were in charge, and they moved her up. So during that time, she maintained her humility as she advanced. She was also wise enough not to reveal her ethnicity or race. And later on especially, she exercised great wisdom and courage. Those were the things that were working for Esther. It was these things that God used and magnified in his providential, sovereign work in the world of the Persian Empire, in the citadel, in King Artaxerxes' kingdom, to use her so that his sovereign work and plan could move forward. So that's what Esther had working for her. Now we have this Jew named Mordecai. Mordecai was the uncle of Esther who adopted her as his own when orphaned as a young child. He raised her lovingly and well, gave her continual wise counsel, intuitively attuned, let me just say this, he was also intuitively attuned to the signs of the times and what was happening to the Jews. Apparently there was some undercurrent there regarding the Jews, and Mordecai was aware of it. He exemplified compassion and courage and resolve to save his Jewish people. So when he found out that Haman had a plan to annihilate all the Jews, he donned on sackcloth and ashes and went into the middle of the capital city of Susa and managed to attract the attention of Esther, and together devised a plan. And he did this knowing full well that it made himself even more of a target of Haman than what he was before. But he was so concerned about his own people. He was so moved by what would happen to them if he did not act, that he risked his life. So then we come to this guy named Haman. Haman is arrogant and very politically ambitious. He is cunning and deceptive and a counselor to King Xerxes. Through that, he eventually became like a vice regent, second in power only to King Xerxes himself. So the person that Esther, the adversary that she had in her life, was the second most powerful person, very cunning, very deceptive, very motivated. He was her adversary. She was a woman, a former orphan, a Jew, a concubine. And she was going to take on the second most powerful man in this enormous empire. Haman, the Agate, was a direct descendant of the Amalekites. We read that in Exodus 17, verses 8 through 16. Agag, the Amalekite king, was defeated by King Saul and killed by the prophet and judge Samuel. The reason why Mordecai and Haman did not like each other was because of what happened throughout their ancestry, or because of what happened to their ancestors 500 years before. That King Saul and Samuel defeated his ancestral people, the Amalekites. And there was this residual hatred. And you think, 500 years, really? Go to the Middle East and see how far back the hatred goes. So they had this long institutional memory. And that's why Mordecai would not bow to Haman when he became like a vice regent, because of that ancestral distrust, and because he knew what Haman was about. So Haman was offended that Mordecai would not acknowledge his new office as like vice regent. And then to top it off, he was a Jew. And he belonged to that people who wiped out his tribe, the Amalekites, 500 years before. So there's this ancestral hatred between these two. So because Mordecai would not bow before his ancient enemy, Haman decided to use his power and influence to not only kill Mordecai. Look, if you have a grudge against somebody, right? A grudge is one thing. You might say something poor about somebody. You might not give them a reference for a particular thing. If you're really nasty, you might key their car or something like that. But if somebody has not acknowledged you in some way, you don't say, well, I'm not only going to key their car, I'm not only going to kill them, I'm going to kill their whole family. I'm going to wipe out everybody. I'm going to wipe out everybody that has anything to do with them in whatever way they're going to go to. I mean, the visceral hatred that Haman had, not only for Mordecai, but for Jews in general, so that he was going to leverage his office, his power, his influence to wipe out every Jew in 127 provinces among 54 million people, including even the Jews who had been sent back to Jerusalem under Cyrus when Zerubbabel went back there and when Nehemiah went back there. He was going to even wipe out those people. That was the nature of his hatred. And he was so convinced, so let me use this phrase, he was so all in his destruction of the Jews that he said to King Xerxes, let me do this. And if you do, I will give you 10,000 talents of my own silver. And you think, okay, that's 10,000 talents. Do you know how much 10,000 talents is worth in today's money? $360 million. $360 million Haman gave to King Xerxes so that he could wipe out all of the Jews. Do you think he was committed? So the question, in one sense, and this is a kind of a rabbit trail, but I wonder how many Christians are as much all in to doing good as Haman was to doing bad. Like if you had $360 million to do good, would you be so convinced of the good that you'd be willing to give $360 million? But he was so convinced that this evil needed to happen against the Jews that he was willing to give from his own resources $360 million. It's a lot of money. In fact, $360 million. So Haman was all in. And this is the kind of person, these were the kinds of resources that Mordecai and Esther had to take on to keep him from doing what he wanted to do to the Jews. So Despite that, providentially, God uses Mordecai and Esther to save the entire Jewish race inside the Persian Empire and to preserve his sovereign plan of redemption through Jesus Christ for all of mankind. So if all of the Jews had been destroyed in the empire of Persia, then it would have broken the redemptive chain that God had already set up, through whom Jesus Christ would come. And so looking from the outside in, with a secular lens worldview, we can see God providentially working in this empire among these people with this person that we don't know what kind of religious faith that she had, if any. We don't know that about Mordecai. We just know that ethnically they were still Jews and that they wanted to save themselves. And it was because God worked providentially in their life that the Jewish race remained intact, and through that race was able to establish his sovereign plan of salvation for humankind. That's what was at stake. So you're not going to read the Book of Esther the same again now, are you? Huh? So we read here, and this is the key text, and I've taken some time to get to it, but this is the key text. We read this in, I want to say chapter 6, in Esther, where it says, "Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther." So messengers were sent to Mordecai, and Mordecai, as they're devising this plan, Mordecai responds to the messengers to go back and say to Esther, "Say this to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place." He's saying, it still could happen, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? An orphan girl, a Jew, a woman, a former concubine, a queen who could not enter into the presence of the king unless she was invited by the king to enter into his presence. In the world's largest, most powerful, and wealthiest empire, against a cunning, deceitful, arrogant, and power-mad career politician, to stop the empire-wide genocide of the Jewish people, she was raised up in this time for that very thing. So the question becomes, for such a time as this, despite your pedigree, why has God brought you into his kingdom? For what purpose do you exist? For stopping what is transpiring through our ancient enemy in the kingdom of this world? Why do you exist? For what purpose has God raised you up? There's nobody. There was nobody in that place and at that time that had any inkling when Esther was a young girl, when she was adopted by her uncle, when she was recruited to be a concubine, and even as a queen. I mean, remember, Queen Vashti, you know why Queen Vashti was deposed? She was deposed because during that 7-day party, they were drunk. And apparently she was beautiful. And so the king requested that Queen Vashti come out with her crown on. Only her crown on. And she was so offended by it, she refused to do it. And so she was deposed as queen. Removed forever, never to see the king again. And for all we know, passed around to other people as part of her punishment. But this is Esther. She could have suffered the same fate. Why has God raised you? Why did God call you to himself? Why does God have you live where you live? Why did he give you the talents that you have? Why do you have the associations, the relationships, and people that you have in your life? Do you think that's all by mistake? Do you think that God's providential hand is not at play in all that? It absolutely is. For this reason, you have been raised up. For such a time as this. And we live in this really weird, wacky time in our culture. And it seems to me that the Christian witness is never more important now than what it's been in my lifetime, certainly. That the darkness that troubles you and I as it emerges and gets darker, look, turn all the lights on here and these lights dim on the tree. Make it completely dark and those little lights light up this whole room. And the darker it gets, whatever light you and I have shines more brightly. So I'm saying, years ago I used to say, this little church on this big hill has a big job. God has a big plan for this little church, right? I used to say that all the time. And I'm just saying that God has raised every one of us here up for such a time. And we all have a job. We all have a calling. We all have a purpose. And you think, I'm not qualified, or I don't know what, God, I can't tell, I can't do what Esther did. You're not called to do what Esther did. You're only called to do what you are called to do. Right? Our job as Christians is not to be successful. Let me say that again. Our job as Christians is not to be successful. Our job is to be faithful. It's God who measures what success really is, not us. So when we leave here today, be resolved that we come together as a people and as a church, and we understand that we have our own kind of ethnicity that the world doesn't really love all that much. And that's okay. And that each and every one of us, as God has placed us providentially in the world in which we live, we have a job to be faithful, to live as much as we can like Christ, so that we let that Christ in us speak and be a light. So spend this week asking for yourself this question, for who knows but that God has raised you up for such a time as this. And answer that question to the best of your ability. And I will too. And we will come back together next week and we'll begin to unpack 1 Peter as Peter addresses in his own day and time how he had been raised up during a remarkable time to speak into people's lives, to live in people's lives, so that the gospel of Jesus Christ could be advanced. Will you pray with me? Lord, thank you so much for this phenomenal story. And that how you took a nobody and because of her faithfulness into somebody, because of your providence and your sovereignty, you just continued to work. And it didn't matter what the forces of the world were going to do. You were going to do what you were going to do to people who chose to be faithful. Doesn't matter what this world does in our life right now. It matters, but we matter more because we will matter more when we choose to live faithfully and obediently to you in this time and in this world in which you live. Help us to leave here today resolved to be that kind of a people, that kind of a person. In your name we pray these things. Amen. Let's stand and sing our last song together.
have our musician is in junior church, so she's on her way, hopefully. There she comes. Yeah, multitasking.
It's my fault. I was supposed to get somebody to cover for them for the children's service, and I got distracted. I apologize.
No, that's fine. It's all good.
Fine.
It's all good.
was